Thank you to Dr. Aquila Flower for coming in and joining us this week. Dr. Flower is Professor of Environmental Studies here at Western and Director of the Spatial Institute, and she will be presenting her talk on her Atlas of the Salish Sea Bioregion. And special thanks to the college and the Alumni Association, as always, for your support of the series. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming inside. As I was walking over here with the beautiful cherry blossoms and sun out there, I thought maybe nobody would actually be in here. Is this doing a weird echo thing?
I can just turn the room volume down.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So many controls involved in it. Okay. So I'd love to get to talk about this kind of passion project and scholarly work that I've been doing, creating an open access digital atlas of the Salish Sea. Have any of you taken the Intro to the Salish Sea Studies class? Okay, a few. It's good. If you have time, you should take it. You get to work with, see some of my maps in there. But that means probably this is news to at least some of you. So this is a project I've been working on for about 5 years. It was sort of my pandemic hobby project. And I'm going to be working on it forever because things always change and you can always update maps, right? But I wanted to go through some things before I show you this Atlas project. A little introduction here, but my goals today are to first talk about the Salish Sea bioregion and what I mean by that if I'm making an atlas of it. Then I want to talk a little bit about the kind of longer term history of mapping the Salish Sea. What do those first maps look like of the region? And then I get to complain a bit about the big challenges involved in mapping a transboundary region that goes across an international border, and then introduce the actual atlas. So you heard I'm a professor of geography and environmental studies. I was also the cartographer for the State of the Salish Sea report that was put out by Western's own Salish Sea Institute. That was the first big environmental comprehensive kind of report in a number of years. So I work a lot both at the Spatial Institute and the Salish Sea Institute on campus here. Okay. Is anybody willing to admit that they don't feel 100% sure where the Salish Sea is? No, you're locals. You got it. Okay. Well, just in case there's any misconceptions, I'll do some definitions. Here to start with is the context of the Salish Sea region, bioregion, I'm calling it, highlighted in green there, set in the context of the large watersheds of North America. You can see it's smaller than, say, the Mississippi or the Mackenzie that you might have heard of. And it's here on this kind of trailing edge here along the Pacific coast. It's a very interesting region because it is so transboundary. It is split almost in half in between the Canadian and US sides, along with land that's governed by more than 80 Indigenous and First Nations governments. So it's a pretty complicated set of jurisdictions. We have about 9 million people living in this bioregion, most of them close to the sea itself. Most people live near the shore. So we often have a sense of place that's tied to our waters here. People who live here mostly are in the Cascadia megalopolis, it's sometimes called, this kind of extensive urban corridor going from Vancouver through Bellingham here down to Seattle, Tacoma, and Olympia. Really kind of clustered population and urbanization in our region. So 58% of this region that I'm showing on the map here is in British Columbia, 42% is in Washington. That means management, restoration, any sort of caretaking of this region is split in between these two countries. But in spite of that border, that little dashed line that you see there, that's a pretty new invention, and it's not apparent on the landscape. It doesn't follow any sorts of natural boundaries. Orcas and salmon and storm systems and forests don't know that there's a border there. And we have really a very long history of interconnected cultures, ecosystems, and physical processes that are unaware of or not stopped by this newfangled international border. So some little geography definitions of where exactly I'm talking about. The Salish Sea itself is known as an estuarine ecosystem because it has a lot of freshwater input from the land. It's marine water from the Pacific Ocean, yes, but mixed with an unusually high amount of fresh water. It encompasses these inland marine waterways of both British Columbia and Washington. When I say inland, it's because it's pretty protected from the open Pacific Ocean. There's not a lot of connection with that open ocean. This pink boundary here delineates the sort of legal definition of what counts as the Salish Sea itself. And then the larger area highlighted in white represents what I'm referring to as the Salish Sea bioregion. And I'll give you my definition of that in a moment. The Salish Sea is composed of three primary water bodies: the Strait of Georgia, Puget Sound, and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Survey and interview results that other researchers have done show that Americans often think that Puget Sound and the Salish Sea are one and the same, whereas many Canadians think that Strait of Georgia and Salish Sea are one and the same. In fact, it's all of these three water bodies, plus their smaller connected inlets and bays and so on, that all make up the Salish Sea. So why do we even talk about these different water bodies, Puget Sound, Strait of Georgia? Well, the bathymetry, the depth of the water, the underwater topography varies quite a lot across the Salish Sea. And that creates these different marine basins that have different circulation characteristics, different oceanographic, chemical, oxygen level type characteristics. So Puget Sound is something that's kind of separate from a lot of the Salish Sea, but not entirely separate, just a little different, right? So I have this map up here with just a bunch of different marine basins you might define, you might label on a map. Each of these is separated either by some coastline feature that creates a little partial barrier, or by what's known as a sill. That's an area where the underwater topography is a little higher, so the water depth is a little shallower, and that's going to affect how water is circulating both horizontally and vertically within the water column. The northern boundary up there, in the northern edge of Strait of Georgia, that's something people often ask me about when I present on this. Why does it just stop there? Because you can see there's water north of it. But in fact, it doesn't look like it makes sense to us because we live on land. We don't experience bathymetry and water depth, but actually the water is quite shallow up there. There are these sills that separate most of the water going north up there will come back south, will not end up passing past that border. So the boundary there on the north is based on what's happening with circulation patterns. In fact, only about 5% of the marine water coming into the Salish Sea has been modeled to be coming in through that northern border. The rest is all through the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the west. Okay, so that's the Salish Sea, defined by bathymetry and circulation patterns. Now, I live on land. I did live on a boat once, but most of the time I live on land. And so I'm interested in what's happening on land and the things that people are doing on land that affect the Salish Sea. So to think about the land that's related to the Salish Sea, I use this concept of a bioregion. There's lots of different ways you could term this, but I like the phrase bioregion. What that means is a region that's defined not by political boundaries, by historical jurisdiction lines, but by some natural features on the landscape that often will reflect more what's going on with the biological and physical processes in a region. Watersheds are a very common way to delineate bioregions. And so for my atlas work, I use the 33 coastal watersheds that drain into the Salish Sea. The Salish Sea does receive water from further inland with the Fraser River, but that area is a very different ecosystem, a very different climate. So I'm using kind of this combination of watersheds and ecological characteristics to say this is a region that's connected through its hydrology, through its marine circulation, and that shares this similarity of climate and ecological characteristics. So that is the Salish Sea bioregion. The labels are tiny up here, but these are the different names of the different watersheds. And these watersheds are important to the Salish Sea itself. It's not just that we live there, but in fact, because there is such large freshwater input into the Salish Sea, the things that humans or other organisms do on land, the things that happen on land, are connected to what happens in the sea, because the streams and rivers that feed from these watersheds into the sea bring nutrients, pollutants, temperature characteristics from the things that are happening on land. So there's this intimate connection in between land and sea for this particular inland sea. Now, it's interesting when you're looking at the contribution of the different rivers in this region, it's very unequal. This chart down here is showing the monthly water coming out of different rivers in our region. I just want you to see that there's that giant green blob there. That's the Fraser River. The Fraser River in British Columbia contributes something like 60% of the fresh water that comes into the Salish Sea each year. That means if you live in Puget Sound, or you live here, we're actually on the Strait of Georgia, technically in Bellingham, but people call it like North Puget Sound, which doesn't make any sense to a geographer. But anyway, if you live on the US side, you have to care about what's happening on the Canadian side, because 60% of the fresh water that's going to drive this estuarine circulation and affect the oceanographic characteristics of the water in Puget Sound, as well as the other bodies of water, is coming from that Fraser River. There's really no getting around the fact that this is an international body of water. You can't really look at half of the picture and think that you're understanding what's happening in the whole picture. Just one last note about this estuarine circulation. This is a diagram I created trying to show the directions of flow of both the marine water that comes in from the Pacific Ocean. It's going to be cold, deeper water. And then on the right here, that kind of green teal color, is what's happening with the surface water flow. So that marine water comes in, bringing nutrients and this cold water from the Pacific Ocean, and it mixes into the basins, right? Coming in through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, primarily, 95% of it, and then spreading north and south. But then it starts to mix with the fresh water that's coming out from the Fraser River, but also the other rivers in our region. And where the water interacts with those sills, those areas of shallower bathymetry, it starts to do this vertical circulation. So it mixes the fresh and the saline water, and that's going to change nutrient, oxygen conditions, and so on. Because of this, we consider this a large estuary rather than simply a marine body of water, purely. Okay, so that's where the Salish Sea is. I'd now like to talk a little bit about the history of the idea of the Salish Sea and maps of the Salish Sea. The Salish Sea is named in honor of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived here since time immemorial and stewarded these waters and lands. This map over here shows the 14 distinct languages, not dialects, but separate languages from the Coast Salish language family that were spoken here at the time of European contact. Amazing linguistic diversity. And that area of kind of the Salish Sea bioregion that I'm talking about largely aligns with the linguistic boundaries of the Coast Salish peoples. So it is named in honor of them, but it is not an indigenous name. As far as I know, there was no single indigenous name for this region. Many people living in different areas would have, for many generations, had different names for different parts of the sea, different relationships with the sea. So I just want to be clear that it is named in honor of our Indigenous and First Nations community members, but not recreating an Indigenous geography. This is a settler concept to think about the Salish Sea from above in these kinds of maps, right? Doesn't mean it's not useful, but that's my disclaimer. So how have people been mapping it? Now, in Coast Salish traditions, this would have been areas of this described in oral tradition. Our first drawn maps come from early European expeditions. This is the oldest map I've been able to find of this region from 1792, from an early Spanish expedition. And I show this to point out the fact that it focuses on the Salish Sea as if it is an obvious inherent region, right? They decided to make a map of some area. What is that area? Well, it's kind of basically what we map as the Salish Sea today. But the name Salish Sea doesn't exist at this time. And in fact, on this map, there's no single name for that body of water that we call the Salish Sea. So the concept of a unified sea has not been named yet. But at the same time, it just makes sense to make a map of these interconnected waters. And this pattern continues. Here's a map and an inset from 1802. More names, more detail along the coastline now, if more surveying. But there's still no single name for the sea, yet it's shown in its entirety, not cut off along an international border or something. Here, 1858, map of the Military Department of Oregon. Now we're focused on US things, but the map extends far enough north that we see almost the entire Salish Sea. even though this is really focused on the US side, it just doesn't make sense to cut off the map to the north. So I show these to make this case that people have known that this region makes sense inherently within itself for a long time. Here's a more recent one, Strait of Georgia and Strait of Juan de Fuca, US Coast Guard Survey 1900. Still, okay, it's a US map, but it shows the Canadian Gulf Islands just as much as it shows the US San Juan Islands. So there's this long history of making maps that show this region, but without a name. When do we actually get a name for it? Well, the oldest map that I've found that delineates this and gives it some sort of single name is this Ish River Country map by McCluskey from 1987. It's a different name, but it's basically the same region. Bryony Penn's A Year on the Wild Side, which is a hilarious good read about ecology, 1999 actually labels it Salish Sea. 2002, less humorous to read, the Georgia Basin Puget Sound Ecosystem Indicators Report maps out basically the current definition that I'm using today, but with a slightly less catchy name for this region, right, with that long name. Then in 2009, Stefan Freeland, who retired from Western last year, created this map as part of a campaign to have legal recognition for the name of this body of water. And this map is really important in my memory because I was a student at University of Victoria when this came out. And I remember the moment when I first saw it. I was walking down this hallway and someone had put it on their door. And I'd heard this phrase Salish Sea before, but I hadn't really paid a lot of attention. I didn't really know what it meant. But I saw this beautiful map and I just stopped in my tracks and went, oh, well, that's where I live. As an American living in Canada, going back and forth across the border, it made total sense to me to ignore the border a bit, right? I knew that there were these similarities that I loved on both sides of the border. And then an amazing coincidence that I ended up coming and working here. Okay, so we have this long history of recognizing the Salish Sea, interacting with the Salish Sea, mapping the Salish Sea for a few centuries. But only very recently did the provincial, state, and federal governments recognize the Salish Sea as a name that's a legitimate place name. In fact, it wasn't until 2009 in the US and 2010 in Canada that these names were accepted. Bert Weber, emeritus professor from the College of the Environment here, led this campaign to get legal recognition for the name, and he was rejected at first. I think because he didn't have a map. I think it was when Stefan made that map that then people could see, oh, the magic of maps. Maps create legitimacy. This has been used for bad purposes in colonialism. This could be used for what you might consider a good purpose. Things seem more real when they're on a map than when you just read the description in a paragraph. Humans respond emotionally to maps in this amazing, powerful way. And so I think that map was really key. Okay, so here we are, legally recognized, but it's so recent that a lot of people don't really know where the Salish Sea is, or they might have a vague sense, but they don't have an appreciation for how interconnected the two sides of this international border are in the Salish Sea. And I would argue that there's really no way to effectively manage and protect and even appreciate a region like this, a transboundary region like this, unless you look across the border at the whole big picture. I think, therefore, that we need a bioregional perspective. Call it what you want, but a transboundary perspective to inform our conservation, our restoration, resource management, and education efforts in this region. Having maps and data that show this region as a continuous whole help people develop a sense of place and care for this place because they recognize it as real and as a coherent ecosystem. In this time right now, with what's going on with federal government relationships with other countries, I think more than ever, it's really key to remember our connection with our neighbors and think about this local bioregional type planning and management that we might have more agency in. So in order to do all of that, we need bioregional transboundary maps and data sets, but we don't always have them. Oh, this map here, just for visual interest, is showing land cover categories in the Salish Sea. And you can see that gray urban area, so restricted to the coastline, little splotches of yellow for agriculture. but really mostly still forest, not old growth forest primarily, but still forest and vegetated, fairly wild areas across a lot of the region. Okay, so backing up a little bit to geography professor stuff before I get into the challenges of doing these maps, I want to say something obvious about what maps should do, but they don't always do. They should provide geographic context for the place or thing that you're talking about, right? That's the point of a map, so you see these relationships with the area around one specific city or body of water. They should show a place's situation. Again, that relationship with the surrounding world, not just its site. You can make a map that's just a point at the coordinates of Bellingham with nothing else on it. I guess that's a map, but it doesn't tell you very much, right? You want to know more details. And a map should show all the relevant things. Now, I think people intuitively know that, and when they look at a map, they kind of assume that it is showing all of the relevant things. Why would the cartographer who made the map not show all of the relevant things? So this map here, just showing rivers in North America, you know, it's got the context all around it. You can kind of see where we are in the world. But too often, we don't end up with a map like this. Instead, we end up with something like this. I mean, how many times have you seen a map of the lower 48 states where it looks like there's just empty space or an ocean to the north where Canada is or to the south where Mexico is? This leads to real confusion, right? You see those surveys sometimes of Americans like not knowing geography very well, and that's kind of like sad and humorous at the same time. But beyond that, I think at a deeper level, this is, even if you're not confused and you do remember that Canada exists, when you keep seeing these maps that leave off our neighboring countries, it implies that they aren't important. They aren't relevant to the story that the cartographer is trying to tell. So we stop thinking about them, right? That is maybe a subconscious kind of thing that happens, but I think it's a strong effect. This is particularly terrible in a border county like ours, where we often see this kind of just like floating island of Whatcom County. This, my very favorite bad map of all time, just from a Google image search, where it's actually blue, where Canada is the same exact color as the ocean. So we don't really understand where Whatcom County and Bellingham are in their geographic context. But this happens, those are some not aesthetically pleasing maps, okay? This also happens in good maps. These are maps from scientific technical reports, data I would trust, but again, they're showing half the picture. We have change in precipitation and barrier culverts for fish over here and wastewater outflow over there. Just notice that each one is showing only US or only Canadian data, or with the snowpack just a little bit into Canada. Now, the researchers who created these maps, I'm sure, absolutely must know that the things that happen on the other side of the border are important. I don't think they left them off intentionally. Rather, it takes so much time and effort to create cohesive data sets across an international border that it's just beyond the scope of a lot of projects. So again, we reinforce this narrative, conscious or not, that you can look at half of this. You can effectively manage an ecosystem, conserve, restore anything without thinking about the other part of this interconnected waterway. Okay, so why is it so hard? It's so hard in the first place because this region has such a complex quilt of jurisdictions, right? This is just showing counties in the US and Canadian regional districts. On the other side of the border, with some urban areas, I'm not even showing in here other jurisdictions. I'm not showing Indigenous and First Nations lands. So many different agencies and jurisdictions manage spatial data for this region. So when you go out looking for data, you're thinking, I want to make a map of wastewater outflows in the Salish Sea or whatever it is. First, maybe the data just don't exist. There are some things that simply haven't been mapped comprehensively. I've been working a lot with a graduate student mapping kelp distribution in the Salish Sea, and there are just many years where we do not have data about kelp. There just weren't enough observations done. So sometimes it doesn't exist. But a lot of the rest of the time it does exist, but it's housed by all these different agencies. And so you have to be familiar with all the different organizations and agencies that would release data, go to their website. Maybe you have to fill out a form to request the data. That alone just takes a lot of time, right? And then once you get the data, you will find that quite often they do not line up. And when I say line up, I mean different things, right? Sometimes they don't line up just in space. They might have different levels of generalization. different coordinate systems. They might have data that's aggregated or averaged over different units, like a county versus a census tract. Sometimes we see just problems with how the data were drawn. This is US and Canadian census data here, kind of off the coast of Vancouver Island, where you can just see there's like this little gap that nobody's claiming in the census data sets. I don't think that area of the ocean is actually up for grabs, but according to the census data set, it's not anybody's country. And then there are these overlaps in between them. So you have to do some correction of the data to get them to just line up in space. In coastal areas like ours, we have to deal with the details of this very sinuous coastline. And here I have this slide about this thing called the coastline paradox, which tells us that there is no objectively true length of a coastline. It depends on the resolution, the scale of your measurements of the coastline. And this little animation here is counting how the shore length of the whole world changes as you move to more simplified and more generalized representations of the coastline. So that is important for our region, for places like Point Roberts here, where you'll often get two data sets and download them and then see that they just don't line up along the coast, especially because people draw the coasts at different tide levels in different years at different levels of generalization. And that's really noticeable on a coastline like ours. Imagine if I had become a professor in Wyoming or something and I could just have a square boundary. But no, we have this beautiful coastline and there's some work in mapping it. Okay, then a kind of silly challenge is simply defining the area. Where is the Salish Sea? There's that legal definition, but it's kind of hidden away in these obscure websites from the geographical boards for geographical names in these two countries. This set of images here shows a bunch of maps from different organizations that are all trustworthy, that I like, but they each show a slightly different boundary for the Salish Sea region. And that just makes it a little hard to compare, like how the area of something changes over time, for instance, because we're talking about different regional definitions. Again, that northern coastline, I tell you, it's just so contentious. So we might differ in our definitions. Okay, so that's all the it doesn't match up in space stuff. That's a challenge, but mostly we can overcome that by just kind of going in and editing the data. The harder part, and the thing that I've spent a lot of time doing, is thinking about the attributes, the information about the things on the map and how those might line up. Sometimes that's something as simple as units of measurement. I can convert, that's okay. Or when the data were collected. The US and Canadian censuses are 1 year apart. It's really annoying to me. Always 1 year apart. So you can interpolate in between those years, but there's this little bit of a mismatch, and sometimes it's a bigger mismatch than that. But the big thing that I really spend my time on is thinking about the categories, the conceptualization of data about the world that are used in different countries or by different organizations. All of this map over here is showing our population density for the year 2010 in the US and 2011 in Canada, because that's just what I could get. So there's some questions that seem simple at first, but are actually quite challenging to work with when you're trying to combine data sets from different areas. You might think, okay, forest types. We have a Douglas fir forest, western hemlock forest, but no, we have different definitions of forest types that can't directly always be translated. There's this arid coastal Douglas fir ecosystem type, British Columbia maps, protects, keeps track of, doesn't exist in the US, according to the kind of official government vegetation classification systems that we use. So if I'm going to make a map of forest types, I have to find some way to translate and find the kind of commonality between them. Which categories of race and ethnicity do you record in census data? This is very different in between the US and Canada. Canada has a pretty lengthy list of multiple ethnicities and racial backgrounds that people can select. The US is much more limited in the categories that exist and in how many categories you can select. So that might seem like something that people would agree on, but no, it is a cultural construct. As much as it affects people's everyday life for real, the idea, the definitions, which categories count, those differ among societies, and you really see that with the census data. And then the last one where I thought this was going to be an easy one, Protected areas. I wanted to make a map of where we have protected areas, parks, right? Makes sense. I found an international data set, Protected Planet, that tries to compile data from all the governments in the world about protected lands. Great, finally something easy. But then I downloaded it and I looked at it, and there was a lot more protected land in the US than in Canada. And I started to look at the details. The US claims like city parks and reservoir protected land and Forest Service land as protected. And Canada does not. Canada claims only the kind of higher levels of protection in national and provincial parks, for instance. So they were actually mapping different things. They were not the same definition of protected lands. All of this takes correcting if you want to have a cohesive data set and map for the whole region. So that brings me from my complaints to my opportunity, which is to be able to improve this situation so that we have more maps that show the whole big picture of this transboundary region. Some maps that I make, but I'm hoping by releasing the data that I compile that lots of other people will make maps, and we won't see so many of those maps that are cut off rather arbitrarily at the border. So my project here, the Salish Sea Atlas, dream of it is to be an open access digital and interactive atlas. So I'll show you an example soon with interactive web maps where people can kind of explore deeper into the data than just looking at a printed map. It also includes some static maps, free open access maps, and I hope that people will use that for education, for policy decisions, those sorts of things where a map can be really compelling and help people understand the story or the importance of a topic. Then I also am releasing the spatial data sets that I compile and harmonize from different sources. I'm not creating brand new data sets. I'm taking data sets from different areas, but in different jurisdictions, different agencies, but then trying to do this harmonization process so that conceptually and spatially, and as much as possible, temporally, they match up across the border. That way people who make maps and know how to make maps can access these data sets and not have to do all this work that it takes. Every now and then, I think this is really frustrating work. Why am I doing this? And then I remember, because it's frustrating, that's why I'm doing it, so that it won't always be frustrating later on, right? Okay, and all of this is hosted with, if you're familiar with GIS, with a company Esri that makes the GIS software we use in our classes here, online through this series of web maps. So I'm going to include links here in case I don't actually know if you release the slides afterwards, but I'll include the links in here in case anybody wants them. The Salish Sea Atlas with interactive maps, but then also these static, just sort of PDF, PNG maps from the State of the Salish Sea report that are in CEDAR in our data manuscript repository through the library. Thank you to funding, Salish Sea Institute, especially Spatial Institute, Border Policy Research Institute on campus. We have a really great set of institutes that support an unusually high amount of transboundary international work here. So now I'm going to try to do something really challenging and switch the screen to show you a browser, and we'll just see how it goes. Okay, so let's see. If I go back to duplicate, I'm going to try it. And I go into Zoom.
The high-stake game.
Okay, here, Zoom people, I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment because who knows, I can't see what you're seeing. Okay. And now I'm just going to share my entire screen. Good. Good. Got it? Okay. Here we go. Beautiful. Possible. Okay. Hi, video. Oh, there we go. Awesome. Okay. The real technical challenge. Never mind the mapping stuff. Okay. So the Salish Sea Atlas, I have, well, here's how you find it. If you don't remember the URL, just type in Salish Sea Atlas. It's the only real one. I've got some static reference maps that you could print out, use for your presentations. It's all Creative Commons licensed, access to data, some news where I put like when I have a presentation or a new poster, or just some fun maps that I make for mapping challenges and stuff. You know, there's just text. But the main stuff is the table of contents here. And this takes you to the set of web maps, ever growing, slowly but surely, each focused on a different theme. So these are each the chapters of the atlas. If you want to read about the definitions of the Salish Sea and understand the names of the marine water bodies, like the small bays and the big inlets, and the names of the islands and all those kind of main details, check that one out. Human populations explore census data. Climate of the Salish Sea bioregion looks at precipitation and temperature and wind directions in our region. My current big project is a climate change analysis for the Salish Sea region, and I have a separate set of web maps about that. Let me just show you freshwater here because I like this chapter. I like all the chapters, just as an example. So each chapter has text describing things, some static maps and charts, and then these interactive components. So perhaps you want to see the full drainage basin or just the Salish Sea watersheds. Maybe you want to know which watershed you live in. And so you zoom in a bit and find, oh, Bellingham there and the Nooksack. And if you click on it, you get some little basic detail. We have the full set of all the streams and lakes, and then it takes a moment to load here. But here are the major rivers where you can click on a river, like the Fraser, our big important one, and see how much water is discharged in different months of the year with this interactive graph. You can extract the numbers there. So I don't know if you need to write a report for a class or something. Here's a data set you can pull from, even if you don't do GIS work. Graphs and things. And then some other interesting details, like thinking about the seasonal variation and how much different rivers contribute to the Salish Sea. Fraser's always the big one, but it's much larger in some seasons than in others. Here's the sort of early summertime when a lot of snow is melting in the upper Fraser and comes out. It's that circle gets giant, right? So you can see the relative contribution from different water sources, which is going to affect nutrients, oxygen, dissolved organic matter, all that kind of stuff in the Salish Sea itself. Okay, so that's the idea that you have these interactive things. You can click on whatever and get some details, some charts. And then at the bottom, data and sources has a set of the sort of a curated list of the most important data sets shown in that section, in that chapter. So here, if you wanted to make a simple web map, say, you want to say, show the watersheds in the Salish Sea. Click on that, and if it loads, right. You can read some details about how I created it, the specific definitions and data sources. And then you can just click Open Map Viewer here. And you have a web map. There you've done it, right? And you can change the details of how it's symbolized, the colors and what's labeled. Click around on here. It's pretty intuitive. You can just kind of read the things. You want to show satellite imagery in the background. You can do that. Maybe we want to see the satellite imagery underneath the watersheds. We can click on these kind of style options, right, that say how we display it. And perhaps we'd like to have no fill inside, just a boundary. I don't like the gray. Can't leave it like that. Okay, maybe something like that. Where you've just created your own map, you can take a screenshot of this or export it, put it in your reports, cite the data source. That's great. Save this as a web map and share the link with people. So the idea is that this is all here for other people to kind of run with and create new transboundary bioregional maps and analysis and storytelling with. Okay, and I think that's just about the right amount of time. Yes, okay, great. All right, thank you. All right.
So time for questions till 5:20. We'll take a few from the room and then we'll see if we have any on Zoom.
Okay. Yeah. Did you say legal challenges? Yeah. The toughest legal challenges? What do you mean by legal challenges? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so like what was one of the hardest things I faced in dealing with data from different jurisdictions? I think that census data with the race and ethnicity stuff really took a very long time to read through and try to figure out how to compile them. I'm still working on the vegetation chapter, and that is also surprisingly challenging to come up with consistent, cohesive vegetation surveys. So kind of all of them, but they each have their own challenges, I guess. I think stuff with temporal data and with a lot of details like the census data is probably the most challenging. Yeah.
Like plans so that future data you're collecting that's from different regions will be like, you won't have the problem again.
Yeah, so do I have plans so that, do you see, I'm repeating the question for Zoom. I never thought I could actually remember to do that. Yes. Do I have plans so that this problem won't happen again as I continue to collect data? I have a bit of a longevity problem. I have to pass this off to an heir at some point, but I've got a lot of years before that. Until then, my plan is to keep updating and expanding this atlas. And all the data is going into ArcGIS Online, so someone else could download it and update it with newer data if they knew how to do GIS stuff. And the idea is that every single data set that I create is available for people to download and use. So now there's just one central source to get these cohesive transboundary data sets. Yeah.
As far as like protection or conservation or like
Mhm.
restoration, other environmental efforts, when you have like a Canadian portion of the
Mhm.
Salish Sea and the United States portion of the Salish Sea, does that mean that like Canada takes care of its own portion and the United States takes care of its own portion, and there's no cooperation between the two countries to protect the region as a whole?
Well, primarily, but that has been. Oh, yeah, just did it before. Okay, sorry, Zoom. That was too good of a question. Are the countries really just doing all their management, restoration, conservation efforts separately without any sort of cohesive plan across the border? To a certain extent, yes, but it has been improving. There is a group in between the EPA in the US and Environment and Climate Change Canada that publishes this Health of the Salish Sea Ecosystem report and is trying to kind of keep track of health. The Salish Sea Ecosystem Conference, fairly new, that was hosted at Western until recently, and that draws together researchers from across the border so they can kind of share some of the information about management. There was just last January, a year ago from January, I went to this conference in BC put on by the British Columbia Transit Authority about the Salish Sea. So there's increasing knowledge and interest about the Salish Sea and trying to think of ways to do transboundary management, but it's really challenging. We have these legal jurisdictions, we have these limitations on what we can fund with government grants. It is tricky, but the more we are aware of the transboundary international nature of this region, I think that the better it will get. Okay, we'll do an online question.
I
Yep.
can repeat this one too.
Okay.
Why is the complete Fraser River watershed not included in Salish Sea?
Why is the complete Fraser watershed not included? Well, I mentioned that in the beginning. Let me show the watersheds map so we know what. The Fraser River, of course, we know is the big important input. Let's see, here we go. And that's this kind of pale green area up here. I don't include that in the Salish Sea bioregion definition because those watersheds in the interior experience a very different climate. They have very different ecosystem types. They're not part of the traditional Coast Salish language area. They seem different to me culturally, ecologically. The people living there are not so aware of the coastline. And it just becomes this very large area for management. I think bioregionalism is most effective at certain scales. And this coastal Salish Sea has kind of cultural similarities in people's sense of place and identity as coastal dwellers, right? As well as similar climate and ecosystem. That said, of course, what is happening in the upper Fraser River is also important for the health of the Salish Sea. But I think it becomes a little unwieldy for people's sense of place and for policy decisions to include so many different ecosystems and climate types. Yeah. Yes.
I was really curious about how developing this atlas in the last 10 years, like how has that been in relation to data communication, and how has there been a learning curve or troubleshooting to really making this understandable to the broader?
Okay, so learning curve in communicating the data, the story of the data to the general public, definitely. And this is a sort of iterative kind of thing where I run it by different audiences and get lots of feedback. I am a geographer and educator by nature and by education, so this is the sort of stuff I love. I've been working on it for 5 years, and in those 5 years, even the web mapping technology has become a little better, a little more flexible. If I was working on this 10 or 15 years ago, doing this kind of web mapping wouldn't really have worked, and it would be really a different beast to try to do this as a printed atlas. Maybe one day I will, but you get to include so much more of the story when you can have people click on things and zoom in and out and look at the scale they want instead of trying to guess and come up with one map that's going to answer all of those questions. So I've learned a lot. I started learning arcade scripting to customize those little pop-up windows that tell you details about the things you click on and so on. And that's really, really fun. I mean, this is why I love geography. I get to learn about the things that I'm mapping, and I get to learn about mapping techniques at the same time. This is great. And that's why I do this, even though mostly nobody pays me to do this. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. How many years you learned to make maps as far as experience schooling to make maps that were detailed?
Okay, how did I learn to make maps? Well, I majored in geography as an undergraduate, and so I had to take some map making classes. I didn't really like it that much. I felt like I don't want to sit in front of a computer all day, but it turns out that it's kind of hard to avoid as a geographer. And eventually I ended up really falling in love with it. But it wasn't so much through classes. It was mostly through me teaching myself. When I graduated with my master's, I got a job working for a climate change research group. And they just sort of assumed that I would know all this GIS and mapping because I was a geographer, and I didn't really. And I tried to be honest, but they didn't believe me. So I had to learn it really fast on my own, reading things at night. And okay, then I got better at it, but it still wasn't my passion. It wasn't until I came here and started teaching GIS, because that's what people needed me to teach, that I started to really actually love doing this GIS work rather than using it as a tool for some other purpose. But working with my students and exploring all these things that I would have never tried to do with the GIS software with my students, that won me over. So now I think it's pretty much the most fun thing to teach. Yeah.
Where Portland, Oregon is, for example?
Yeah, so the Salish Sea Bioregion, 50-50 success rate. Okay, are there any other bioregional names, bioregions that people talk about? And the question specifically referenced Portland. There's this larger bioregion known as the Cascadia bioregion. Many of you have probably heard about that. I would say the Salish Sea is sort of a nested bioregion within it. Not conflicting. You can have nested watersheds, you can have nested bioregions. So the Cascadia bioregion, again, there's no international body that says, here's the definition of a bioregion, because it's this sort of imaginary aspirational geography, right? Where we're creating it, the people involved are creating it. But the Cascadia bioregion is something like coastal southern Alaska down into maybe northern California and over as far as Idaho, kind of following the Columbia drainage basin. And people get into all these. If you go on Reddit and look at the Cascadia subreddit, people get into a lot of really heated arguments about where the boundaries should go. That does not interest me. But yeah, Cascadia is probably the most famous one, I think. There are some initiatives around the Great Lakes region, which are also a transboundary set of water bodies, to do some cohesive mapping across that region. I don't get the impression that it has kind of garnered as much steam for bioregional recognition yet, but that's another example. And there's a lot of interest in Europe in bioregionalism and thinking about these connections between, kind of smaller countries compared to what we're dealing with here. Yeah.
Curious, you have already include natural heritage data like all the salmon runs and watersheds.
Okay, do I want to include, what did you say, natural heritage? Like you said salmon runs?
Yeah.
Yeah, any other examples of kind of this category you're thinking about? Rare plants? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do I want to include like rare, maybe I'd add endemic plant species? Yes, but that's kind of a little further down the road, I think. Getting cohesive salmon run data across the border is surprisingly frustrating. So hopefully I'll tackle that eventually. Rare and endemic plants, yes, I have some thoughts about that, but I'm going to start with the vegetation chapter. Should hopefully come out this summer. I've said it in public, so I have to actually finish it. Trying to think about just coarser ecosystem types to start with, but eventually, yes, then working into some more rare and endemic species. So there's infinite growth. I can map things forever and ever, as much as I could think of things. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, one last?
Very quick question.
Okay.
Then we'll call it.
I was just wondering if you've worked with any like indigenous communities to understand their boundary bioregions at all?
I have not. I have not worked with any indigenous groups to understand their bioregional boundaries. The Salish Sea definition kind of only became accepted because it was brought to a set of indigenous governments and it kind of had their approval. I have heard some interesting things from indigenous groups who do not speak a Coast Salish language about their feeling that calling it the Salish Sea excludes them from it, right? And it's really easy as settler colonists to kind of think about this monolith of indigenous identity, and that's not true. Not everyone here has always spoken Coast Salish languages. That's beyond my ability to solve, I think, but I hear it, yeah. Okay,
Thank
out of
you.
time. Thank you so much, everyone.